Our reading this morning is from Amos. Alas, for you who desire the day of the Lord, why do you want the day of the Lord? It is darkness, not light, as if someone fled from a lion and was met by a bear, or went into the house and rested a hand against the wall and was bitten by a snake. Is not the day of the Lord darkness, not light, and gloom with no brightness in it? I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them, and the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream.
The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Today we're tackling a tough topic that is racism and policing, and it will surely be uncomfortable for some because we are taught to revere police, and we should. If we are white, we are taught to trust police officers because they are in our neighborhoods to protect and serve. And yet, a few weeks ago, Jim Wallace reminded us that the black moms and dads have learned from experience that police don't always treat black boys and men the same as white boys and men. Implicit bias kicks in, and sometimes blacks are pulled over or apprehended when there is little or no cause. And this happens enough in our nation, all over our nation, that it is impossible for us to continue to ignore it and to say that it only happens in isolated incidences in isolated communities. Most of us have experienced and take part in implicit racial bias. And we do this in a place and from a place of privilege. We do things that we do and we don't even realize because we have been steeped in privilege, and we have been steeped in a community and a culture that has racial bias in it, embedded. Racial bias that leads to discrimination and unfair treatment is unjust, and it is a burden that must be lifted from our hearts and from our nation. And this won't be easy. Amos's very name means in Hebrew to lift a burden. What burdens were present in Amos's world that were so moved this young shepherd man to leave his flock of sheep, to leave all the comforts of home, to march defiantly to the nation's capital in order to speak truth to power? For this is what Amos did. And what burdens might move us, we who call ourselves people of faith and conscience? What would move us to do the same? The injustices that were present in Amos's day were poverty, marginalization, greed, militarism, and the privilege of one group at the expense of another. In Amos's time, Israel was a strong, dominant state compared to Judah in the south. Israel was economically superior, and Judah was in political bondage to Israel. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few, and the ruling elites controlled the government. Amos saw how wealth flowed from the working poor to the ruling class instead of the other way round. Unemployment increased, and the working poor became peasants, an underclass of expendables who were soon in debt, forced into slavery with no real freedoms. Only 2% or 3% of the populace at the time of Amos's day could afford education, and higher education was only for the rich, even in those days. Large amounts of the nation's resources of Israel and Judah that could have been spent on humanitarian concerns such as education and health care were siphoned off to pay for King Jeroboam's war against Damascus. This happened in the 6th century BCE. And Amos could see that the war with Damascus, against Damascus, would lead only to destruction. In the face of all these burdens, the prophet Amos says, alas, Do you hear the sadness and the remorse and the frustration in his lament? The day of the Lord is here, and instead of us expecting light and happiness and joy and hope, we hear here that the day of the Lord in Amos's mind is sad and tragic. It is a day of darkness, which seems to be going on from bad to worse. He says it's like the person who flees from a lion only to find that it's being chased by a bear. And then when he goes into the house to escape to safety, he puts his hand on the wall and is bitten by a snake. And it reads a little bit like a children's book, doesn't it? But this is no child's play. Perhaps the darkness is just too dark for light to ever break in, Amos wonders. Have you ever felt like that? By now we listen closely for words of encouragement from Amos, but instead this prophet rants. He speaks for God. Amos insists, God, Yahweh, will hate and despise your religious celebrations. Yahweh will not accept our offerings, will not listen to our songs of worship. Clearly, Amos is shouting, pleading for all to see that separating faithful practice and belief from the very real burdens of the world angers God. Our beliefs and faith must be acted on in real time, in real action, in this very real and broken world. Today. God will not wait for someday in the great by and by to lift the burdens of the poor, the oppressed, and the downtrodden by simply lifting them to heaven. God's salvation will break in now, in this time, with judgment and justice that will be redemptive and grace-filled. It won't be easy or comfortable for oppressors because God will upend the status quo. I know some of you are uncomfortable with this whole series. And I ask you, don't want to talk about poverty, economic disparity, and inequality? And how it intersects with racism? Is it just too uncomfortable, or is it too political for worship? Amos clearly doesn't think so. God fills Amos with a prophetic word that we need here today that is meant to shake us and all of humanity from our complacency. God moves Amos to speak up and act, to do something about the injustices he sees around him. He says God's justice will roll like an ever-flowing stream for the salvation of all of us. God will lift our burden of racism. Perhaps you read in the Star Tribune yesterday in the business section, climate activist Greta Thunberg, who is just 16, shook hands. There was a picture, I should have showed it, with Christine Lagarde, managing director of the International Monetary Fund. She was standing in that picture, shaking her hand, and she said to Ms. Lagarde, speaking about climate action, she said, I want you to act as if you were in a crisis. I want you to act as if the house is on fire, because it is. And Amos would agree. Our house is on fire. The beloved community is at stake whenever racism is left to run rampant in our lives. I want to begin by saying this very clearly. Blue lives matter. Yes. And black lives matter. Yes. And as people of faith, we don't have to choose a side. But we must work to address the tensions between the two and between all of us in our nation. Because something is very wrong in our nation when 1 in 3 black men are likely to be incarcerated in their lifetime. 1/3 of black men are likely to be incarcerated in their lifetime. That is millions of black men. And this is a crisis. It cannot continue. It is untenable. And it is a burden that is caused for not only blacks, but for whites and for all of us, black and white. It is heavy and it needs to be lifted. Now, I want to be clear again. I believe blue lives matter. Police officers put their lives on the line every day. Their work is dangerous, and many thousands of law enforcement professionals are injured or killed in the line of duty. They are out there because they believe in their work, and they are dedicated. They work long hours. They are forced to make difficult, life-changing decisions very quickly, sometimes with very little information at hand, and they are the first responders in uncertain and scary circumstances that we can't really understand, no matter how many police shows we watch on TV. And they deserve our gratitude and our respect. But the problem comes, as Jim Wallace points out in his book, America's Original Sin, when those who have been sworn to serve and protect as guardians of peace become warriors or soldiers. If the court appoints someone to be a guardian for a child, the guardian serves and protects the child, making sure they have what they need to thrive. Guardians watch over the child, shield them from harm. Guardians are in relationship with that person and with many others as a team for whom they have been entrusted in their care. And to be sure, there are many police officers who act as guardians in the truest sense of the word every single day. They show up in the middle of the night when people are in trouble. They rescue hurting people. They intervene in domestic abuse calls. They help families in medical crisis. They help sort down, calm down. There are so many ways that police officers act as guardians, serving and protecting. But there are some in police departments and academies who are approaching policing with a warrior mindset instead of a guardian mindset. And when they do, there's a stark difference in their actions, because there's a stark difference between the warrior mindset and the guardian mindset. Susan Rauer was one of the members of President Obama's task force on 21st century policing, and she describes it this way. Although police officers wear uniforms and carry weapons, the similarity to soldier ends there. The missions and rules of engagement are completely different. The soldier's mission is that of a warrior, to conquer. The rules of engagement are decided before the battle. The police officer's mission is that of a guardian. It is to protect. And the rules of engagement evolve as the incident unfolds. Soldiers must follow orders. Police officers must make independent decisions. Soldiers come into communities as an outsider occupying force, and guardians are members of the community protecting from within. But who can blame the police for taking on a warrior mindset? I learned this week in my research that in 1996, the National Defense Authorization Act came into being, and it allowed the United States Secretary of Defense to give local law enforcement the Department of Defense's excess military equipment at no cost. It was a program under 1033 created by that act. And according to an article in Washington Post, in 1998, about $9.4 million of equipment was transferred to 290 law enforcement agencies. By 2014, 3,029 law enforcement agencies received transfers nearing $800 million in value. And that number just keeps climbing. They were sent an array of military equipment worth over $1.5 billion between 2006 and 2014. And here's what we sent. More than 6,000 mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, 79,289 assault rifles, 205 grenade launchers for policing our cities, 11,959 bayonets, 50 airplanes, 422 helicopters, and $3.6 million in camouflage and other deception equipment. Welch and Meriwether, who did some research on this, said, quote, even controlling for other possible factors in police violence, such as household income, overall and black population, violent crime levels, and drug use, more militarized law enforcement agencies were associated with more civilians killed each year by police. And many of these folks are black. Now remember, Blue Lives Matter. Police have to risk their lives every day responding to violent criminals and they need adequate protection. But it is also true that when we have talked about addressing crime at a policy level, we tend to use military terms. I talked with Jim Ahrens this week, and he works in this field, and he also sings. And he said, remember the war on crime in the 60s and the war on drugs in the 80s and the 90s? As a society, we seem to see the most forceful response to a problem to be couched in military terms. A problem for warriors, not for guardians. We want crime fighters, not guards. And he says, of course the police are a paramilitary organization, and in some ways they have to be. We want a great deal of discipline and control in any organization authorized to use deadly force. But police can't really fight crime. They have to wait until crime is committed, and then they have to respond to it. And the only way police stop crime from occurring is by arresting people and keeping them from committing yet another crime. And they can't get involved until the first crime happens. There are many who believe that officers really have to have a warrior mentality or they'll be killed. All of this is to say this is a complex issue, and there are people on both sides who are trying to figure out the best way to do policing. People who care, people who are smart, people who want better answers. It is a complex situation and a complex world. But it is also true that when police are able to maintain a guardian stance rather than a warrior mentality, when they look for other options first before they resort to use of weapons to try to defuse a situation, they are often able to de-escalate crime. I read an article, and I'm sorry I can't remember the author, and I should have written it down right here, and it's not there, but it's called The Occupiers. It's a book called The Occupiers, The Making of the 99% Movement. You can look it up. And the author of that book argues that the tactics aimed at combating violent radicalization tend to have a radicalizing effect on protesters and escalating effect on police encounters. Crucially, they also have a chilling effect on nonviolent forms of protest, leaving little space for anything but confrontation. Well, that's a lot of statistics. That's a lot of information, and I bet you just need to take a deep breath. What does this have to do with race? I checked out the Minneapolis crime statistics this week from the Minneapolis Police Department website, and it says there, as I think it does in most cities, blacks are far more likely to experience use of force from our police than whites. No surprise there. This may be due to heavier policing in areas of poverty where a percentage of persons of color live in those areas. But here's the good news. There's some good news. In Minneapolis, our police are becoming more and more committed to practicing community policing, where they are forming committed partnerships of leaders in the community, in the religious community, in the business community, and in the education and schools. And they are working with leaders in the community to get to know people and to be known in the neighborhoods. They are starting to more and more employ a guardian role when they can. They show up at schools. I saw a video in the Minneapolis Police Department's website. They were handing out car seats to people. They were feeding the homeless. They were looking for ways to connect with people in coffee shops, with cops for coffee. And they had done all these things. And you know what's happening because of it? Crime is going down. And incidences that are experiencing force from police are actually going down. The rates are declining. That's a good thing. And it's true in St. Paul as well. But we still have to face some hard facts about racism in our criminal justice system. According to Kelly Walsh, author of Black Criminal Stereotypes and Racial Profiling from the Journal of Contemporary Criminal Justice, Kelly says this: the citizens of the United States make up 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. 1 out of every 15 African American men and 1 in 36 Latino men in the United States are currently incarcerated. How does that compare with the incarceration rate of white men? And 1 in 106 white men in prison. Let me tell you that again. For blacks, what was it again? 1 in 15. Quite a difference. Black men have a 1 in 3 chance of being incarcerated at some point in their lives. And it's no different for women, a little bit less. There are 13% of women in America are black, and 30% of incarcerated women are black. President Obama called for a president's task force in 21st century policing in 2014, and he said, when any part of the American family does not feel like it is being treated fairly, that's a problem for all of us. But perhaps you are thinking, I want to do something, but what can I really do? The first thing is, do not be afraid. If we, the citizens of our communities and neighborhoods, adopt a warrior attitude, entering conversations about racism and policing with defensiveness, we can't learn and we can't look for solutions. We are called to be guardians too, because when we are guardians of one another and of the beloved community, God's justice flows. We can support police officers by praying for them and partnering with them to be the change we seek in our neighborhoods. This means we'll need to get to know our neighbors, meet the business leaders in our neighborhood, partner with neighborhood groups so that we can serve all people regardless of their race, and we can work for equity. And we can do this. How will you be a good neighbor this week? Jesus said, love your neighbors as I have loved you. The second thing we can do is work to end the school prison pipeline. Study shows that black students are disciplined more severely in schools for doing the very same things white students do. No tolerance policies and police presence in schools has actually been shown to increase behavioral problems, not decrease them. It takes the authority away from the principals and the teachers and gives it to law enforcement, and things escalate quickly. Minor behaviors that could have been handled and stopped by teachers and principals and worked out escalate into arrests and feed the school to prison pipeline, especially for students of color. Speak up for fairness and equal treatment for all. Help lift the burden of discrimination. Friends, we are called to be agents of God's justice and righteousness. And when the problems of racism and privilege and bias seem just too big to overcome, remember this: God is our guardian, our protector. God will go with us as we work for justice and peace and fairness in our world. God's justice will keep on flowing through prophets like you and me. At times, God's justice will seem like it is just meandering slowly through the crevices of our systems. At other times, it will surge. But all of the time, it will be steadily wearing down the systems that oppress, that bind and belittle. If we are willing to be used by God to be God's instrument of justice, mercy, and peace. It's not going to happen overnight. Justice takes time and persistence, but I believe, and I hope you do too, that God's justice will continue to move through the calcified canyons of indifference until finally God's justice breaks through like an ever-flowing stream, washing over our nation like a sweeping flood. Now, the question is this: will we call forth the courage to let the flow of God's justice take us where it will?